So without further ado, we're going to have our first panel of the afternoon come out talking about the ABCs of A/B testing. To introduce all of the wonderful experts, I'd like to bring on stage Senior Director of Digital Audience Development at A&E Networks, Jen Taylor. Please give them all a warm round of applause. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the ABCs of A/B testing. We have three panelists here today. We have Suman Patnaik, Justin Adler, and Alon Wertheimer. So Suman is the testing and personalization lead at IBM. She is a creative problem solver who works cross-functionally with team members to develop effective content strategies based on data from testing. Justin is the co-founder and COO of NorthOne, a tech-forward, mobile-first business banking service. He has experience in product development, marketing, operations, and PR, focusing on building and evangelizing emerging technologies. And finally, Alon was the VP of growth at Aaptiv, the #1 audio fitness app. He is a marketing professional with a proven ability to scale paid acquisition channels as well as increase product activation rates. So before we get started with our panelists, I'd love to get a sense of our audience's experience with A/B testing. So how many people here have ever run an A/B test? Great, that's a lot of people. So how many of you leverage A/B testing regularly? Fantastic. Okay, so let's start with each of our panelists walking through how they use A/B testing and the tools that you use.
Sure, so I'll start. I specifically deal with A/B testing for marketing and specifically marketing campaigns and marketing pages. And so when you think about the scale and the sheer number of marketers at IBM, it's around over 5,000 marketers. And so the A/B testing program really aims to decentralize testing. And so you see a lot of nuances then with the team's level of experience from novice to advanced. And that also applies to their experiments. And you know, the testing plans then fit in context of their campaign plans. So there's a lot of nuance on how testing is performed at IBM simply because of that scaling. And the testing program is actually fairly new. It just started around 2 years ago. And it has evolved rapidly. What was once a very centralized function where really one person was the bottleneck controlling all experiments, suddenly now it's been democratized where all marketers are in charge of testing their campaigns. So we've gone from one test in 2015 all the way now to over 2,000 tests running. So progress has been made, but there's still more to be made. But happy to be on this panel and discuss our progress so far.
So what led your company to decide that you needed this program, and how did you kick it off?
Yeah, so it was determined that we needed to test our experiences, period, because as our customers' needs are evolving, as our products are evolving, the landscape is evolving, so should our digital experiences. And nothing was done up until that point that was really validating any assumptions or testing any hypotheses. Rather, it was more of these really long planning sessions with agencies, designing something based on gut experience rather than truly validating an assumption. So we worked to get a vendor on board, and the structure has been slowly evolving, like I said, from a centralized one to something that is decentralized. And there have been growing pains in scaling that adoption. But for the most part, marketers understand the need for testing and its impact on the campaign plan in the end, through the whole buyer journey from early learn, late learn, try buy to finally adopting and advocating for a product. And all of this is in context of the product itself. You have some products which are as easy as downloading and paying with a credit card. Other products that have a whole sales cycle, right? When you think about servers or mainframes, those are not instant wins. Those take a lot of nurture and follow up with sales reps. And so how testing fits into that whole journey is something they've come to embrace now.
Fantastic. Justin?
Yeah, so Thanks. That was great, by the way. So I'm the COO of NorthOne, and unlike something like IBM, we have a SaaS-based business banking service. And so for us, first off, we're dealing with a mobile application, so there's no desktop variation and testing. But we look at A/B testing and the role of CRO a little bit more holistically, where for us, we're not just trying to drive a lot of downloads, we're not just trying to drive a lot of signups to our service, but we're actually trying to optimize against lifetime value. So it's really about making variations within the actual product, running multiple instances of the application, and then testing that against metrics like churn and sell-through to make sure that we're acquiring the best users long term.
Cool. And what tools are you using?
So we use mostly development tools for this, where we'll use tools like Docker or Heroku. So these are not necessarily marketing tools, or we'll set up multiple instances of our application, and then we'll try to actually control and segment based on acquisition source. So we use something like AppsFlyer to kind of do our initial segmentation on the download, and then we'll kind of look at the downstream effects of changes that we're making within the application.
Fantastic. Alon?
Very cool. So for Aaptiv, we're a B2C platform. We're a mobile app, and basically all of our A/B testing has come from a place of, I'll call it humbleness. We don't really know what's happening. We are making assumptions and guesses and just trying to make sure that we're making the right decisions moving forward. So a lot of the A/B testing that we've been doing has been around the advertisements, about what is the real motivation that's going to be bringing people into our product, and within the product too, how do we tell our story? Should we go this route or that route? So a lot of product activation. And in terms of the platforms we've been using, it's been mostly Mixpanel and Optimizely, as well as our own developed in-house system to measure the results.
Fantastic. So how do you decide what should be A/B tested? The question of the hour.
Yeah, so that's, I think a question with a lot of different answers. I mean, what should be A/B tested for us is broken down into two things, the page itself and then the content on the page, right? Captain Obvious here. And so we, first of all, identify what are the top traffic pages, but we're obviously optimizing for the action on those pages. But the reason we focus on the high traffic pages is because think about how many pages we have out there. We have around 6 million pages, and we're going through a page audit and we're cleaning everything up. But that is a lot of pages, and teams that are testing on inconsequential pages usually end up with tests that just run indefinitely. And so they're not bringing value at a rapid pace. And the point of testing these marketing campaigns is to iterate on the campaign before the learnings become a moot point, right? If the test is running longer than the campaign lifetime, what is the point? And so first off, we focus on those high traffic pages per business unit. We have around 20 business units, and then that spans across all the geographies worldwide. And so then all those geographies are then creating localized pages. So really we ask each of the teams, and call them diamond teams, to focus on what are your at least top 10 high traffic pages, and then based on that page, what is the goal of the page in context of whatever it is in the buyer journey. If it is just a marketing landing page, what is that trying to do? Is that trying to drive to the next click to keep the visitor engaged down the funnel, or is it supposed to be a try-by offer? So then we get them to think about the content itself. Are you driving to a new asset like a white paper, case study, video? Or are you driving to some kind of gated offer, and does it make sense in the context of that specific audience? And so we really do have marketers assess the content analytics, how content's performing, also in context of that audience then. And are we targeting the right audience for that test? Or is there another audience that has more of an affinity to that particular product or topic?
So you mentioned that your tests are tied to campaigns. So you only run tests during campaigns. How long do those campaigns usually run for? Right,
yeah. So not all tests are actually specifically tied to campaigns, but most of them are. In a quarter, we'll have around 500 campaigns. And this includes worldwide and all the geographies, all the localized pages and campaigns. And those campaigns can run from anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half. And so, the cadence at which teams are testing really depends on their campaign plan and then how their test plan fits into that campaign plan, and what learnings we're trying to glean, and constantly being fluid with that campaign plan, because historically, IBM has spent months planning a campaign and just pushes it out, and then there's no room for fluidity or flexibility. And so part of what we're trying to instill is this culture of experimentation and flexibility within the campaign planning process, so that it's not just going on a gut check or very old learnings, but rather something that is fresh and new, constantly being iterated upon.
Cool. Let's jump over to Alon.
On my end, the way that I try to prioritize what I'm going to be testing first and second, it definitely differs if it's a advertising-based A/B test versus a product-based. For product, I didn't make this up, but I read somewhere about ICE, impact, confidence, and effort. And I like to use those three different metrics or different attributes to determine what I want to do first, second, and third. And I think about the overall throughput, because there's always going to be some constraint that's limiting how many tests I'm going to be able to do or will be able to do. Will it be engineering time? Will it be time to get enough traffic? Will it be budget? So if I understand what that constraint is, then I could think about how do I get not just the most test, but the most quality test given that constraint. For advertising, it's a little bit different. I think about the certain advertising channels that everyone works on and will consistently do, and it's a certain amount of time until a certain advertisement goes stale. So I think about how long do I have until that ad goes stale, and it kind of dictates how often do I need to keep testing.
And how do you determine how long each test runs for?
It really depends on whether there's a massive, it's really case by case. If there's a massive difference in performance, you could really know the results pretty quickly. And if it's neck and neck, then you may not know for some time. So I'd say for tests where you're measuring a top of the funnel event and you want to know what's happening downstream too to make sure you're not shooting yourselves in the foot, I'd give it more time to make sure that you don't just look at the top of the funnel, but the entire funnel. And for other events where you are focusing the signal is really close to the event that you're testing, it could be a lot more rapidly.
But it also matters by the number of variations in the experiment as well, right? And that impacts your sample size. And then you also have to think about how detectable is the change I'm making. If it's bold enough, then you can make that correlation to the change as having some kind of lift or whatever decrease in performance. And so you have the number of variations, you have how detectable that change is, and what that potential baseline conversion rate is. All of that goes into then your calculation for taking that sample size and dividing that by your daily visitation or traffic. And that usually determines how long a test runs. At least that's how we try to quantify it for our marketers.
We'll jump back to Justin's answer to the last question, but first, how do you guys think about variations? How do you decide how many versions of something to run?
I mean, it depends on your traffic, right? You want to make sure that you are able to, within a reasonable time frame, be able to get enough conversions or whatever you're testing, positive results essentially within each variation within a reasonable time frame. Like if you're testing 10 variations of a marketing page or an app feature or something like that, and you really have maybe like a low CTR on your ads, so you know that it'll take you a year to get 100 conversions on each, right? It's probably too many variations. You kind of want to reduce that.
So is there an optimal number?
I mean, again, it depends on your marketing spend. It depends on your I don't know, daily active users. But I mean, typically, especially if you're not dealing with huge volume, maybe stick to 2 variations. Maybe have a control in a single variation. As a best practice, what we typically do, especially in product testing, is we'll always do kind of like an AA test instead of an AB test first. To understand the variation in our traffic and the variation in user behavior, so we can control against false positives, and that's one of the first things that we do.
Can you walk us through what an AA test is? Just in case?
Yeah, sure. So what you would typically do is you'd split your traffic. If you're doing something like a marketing page, you might actually just split your traffic to 2 identical pages, and your marketing testing software might actually tell you that one is 15% better. Hilarious, right? So this basically does 2 things. First of all, it lets you know if your marketing software is working properly, but also, more than anything, it lets you understand what a null variation is in the traffic. So you know that, okay, if I throw in a variation and it also converts 15% better, it's probably kind of just the traffic. And that's super important to identify first.
Yeah. On a very similar note, something that we've done at Aaptiv is when we do run experiments, we have 3 controls, and then we have the variations. When we look at the total results, we add up the results from the 3 controls together. But it does help us understand if there's bias in just the way the test is being structured.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Justin, how do you decide what should be A/B tested?
Yeah, so for us, you know, the growth team is part of the product team because we're dealing with a SaaS subscription model. So really, they're kind of filtered down from product decisions, and we use hypothesis-based testing. So we say, okay, we think that modifying the flow of this feature or modifying our onboarding experience will ultimately lead to a higher lifetime value or lower churn. And then we'll create a hypothesis based on that. Usually it's something very, very specific. So we think that if we reduce the number of steps in our onboarding flow from like 10 to 5, we'll see a lower drop-off, let's say, in subscriptions. And so I think that's usually how we start constructing them. And then, as I said, we kind of introduce a null variation, understand how the traffic behaves, and then iterate based on that.
Yeah.
So how often do you find that your hypotheses are right, and how often do you find that you're proven wrong?
My hypotheses are proven wrong almost always, but my team usually has a better success rate than me. I actually find that usually like our product designers and our developers, when they kind of create hypotheses as a team, usually have a much better success rate. Whereas, you know, I tend to, as the COO, be a little bit more strategic and kind of look at what the market's doing and try to kind of introduce, I guess, more like wildcard testing, which has a far lower success rate, but that's okay. You know, I think for us, we perceive kind of failed tests or tests that really don't improve as really that's a good result, right? You just want to get to that fail fast.
Mm-hmm. Same.
Does anyone have a story of an A/B test that they ran that they were really surprised by the results?
Yeah, I've got one. Okay. So, like most good ideas, I steal them from our competitors and I study their funnels. And one thing that kind of surprised me is we looked at Peloton's funnel, being another fitness app. I've always been taught that the best practices for conversion to get someone to buy from you is to have as minimal friction as possible. But on Peloton's app, before they send you to Apple in order to confirm the purchase, they preface all the different payment details, and they add that element of trust and security that we're not trying to rip you off. And we added that extra step within part of our sales funnel, and I was surprised that adding another step to a sales funnel actually did improve conversion.
It's a great example. So Justin, you mentioned a little bit about kind of metrics you use. We talked a little bit about customer lifetime value and churn as a proxy. So out to the group, how do you decide what metrics determine success? And is that consistent for all of your tests, or does it change per test that you run?
So we have one really funny North Star metric, which if there's any kind of mobile game publishers in the audience, this might make you like bleed from your eyes. But you know, our goal as a digital banking application is to help people get their banking done fast. So we really are trying to solve for a lot of daily active users and return users, but we're actually trying to optimize against time spent in app. So when we see that users are spending more time in app over a test or when we kind of modify flows, we really see that as a negative sign. And so yeah, that's just a specific metric that we use across all our tests.
Suman?
Yeah, so I mean, the metrics that we choose are very nuanced, again, depending on the campaign and the page goals. But I would say, our usual North Star is click-through, because we're focusing on drives to that next click and that next click, so that they're constantly engaging with the content and with the brand of IBM. But there are other more nuanced metrics, like the scroll depth, like time on page, possibly even page views, if we are tracking a new CTA that may be placed, leading to a subsequent page. But it really does depend on the team and their end-to-end analyses of the campaign so far and the pages.
Yeah. On my end, it really depends on what stage of the funnel am I doing the testing. If it's at the very beginning of the funnel before sign up, then I measure sign up and all the key events leading towards us making money, which is, let's say, someone starting a trial. And another key indicator is just because as an app that we're trial-based and subscription-based, we want quality users. leading indicator of whether someone will be a lifelong member, and a high-value member will be whether they start to take a workout class. So that's our indicator that we use to make sure that the traffic is not just, well, it's not just a low CAC, not just a low cost per acquisition, but high lifetime value as well.
Cool. So statistical significance is really important when it comes to A/B testing. How do you confirm that your tests are statistically significant and that you should trust the results?
Sure, I can dive in. So before we start our tests, we always kind of set like benchmark metrics. So we understand, what our margin of error is, what our confidence interval is. So we understand, okay, was the result significant? But one thing I really want to kind of drive home is that I think for a lot of marketers, they perceive statistical significance as a sign of repeatability in testing, which is for sure not the case. So you can actually run a test which has achieved statistical significance, but then run that same test again, maybe a few weeks later, and have different results. So I think really to understand predictability, you need to sometimes even run the same test several times.
Cool. Alon, any thoughts?
No, I think that's actually a really, really good point. A lot of times when we were at Aaptiv, since we were a much smaller company, well, actually, you're 15 people, so we were about the same size. We were trying to go so fast. It was really important for us to run tests quickly and take wins and run and do it again. And a lot of times, I would love to tell people, go use a two-sided z-score and just look at what the number is, and if the p-value is high, fantastic. But other times, we had to make decisions because we had to move the metrics before we actually had that value. And it was risky, but what we would do, we would look at the overall performance of the test. We would break it out into certain segments. Let's look at it by geo, by day, by type of phone. And if across all the more micro, if the trend of a winner was consistent through all the micro segments, then we would have more confidence that even though it's not statistically significant because there's such a pattern, we'd feel better about making such a decision.
Yeah, and to add on to what Alon said, I mean, that's exactly what we encourage our marketers to do as well. Just because, there is no way to centrally govern 5,000 marketers and how they're interpreting their significance. So we always encourage them to break it down into the segments and understand across those micro segments if those results are consistent. Because, these are teams that are trying to optimize as fast as possible to make sure that they're implementing and pushing into production the changes they've learned about in their campaigns. And so they, usually rely on the stats engine from Optimizely, but they're breaking down the results across those segments.
So this is really interesting. You're making a hypothesis, you're testing something out, and then you're implementing the results. How often do you just take the results and implement versus actually try to figure out why? Why did this happen? Why did this win? How can we learn and implement that someplace else?
Yeah, well, so looking at more, both qualitative and quantitative tools, right? So diving into pre and post test, the page performance or the campaign performance and understanding what it was like before and trying to draw correlations, even though that doesn't imply a causation. But then also then looking at the more qualitative things like the heat maps and the user recordings and to understand, what the very personal individual interactions on the page are. And so then you can start drawing this holistic picture based on the numbers, but tying it to an actual person or individual or an aggregate user behavior.
Yeah, so maybe it seems kind of obvious, but one big learning for us was, you can just talk to your users. So many people sort of look at data and try to abstract the actual customer from the, testing experience. And we'll send out kind of basic NPS scores and feedback, but we'll also schedule user interviews sometimes and kind of mention okay, so we noticed you use this feature. What did you like about it? And for sure, it's a small sample size, but it's somewhat descriptive for sure.
So how are you reaching out to your users, and what kind of response rate do you see?
Yeah, so it depends. Sometimes we'll do we'll just contact them directly via email. Sometimes we'll contact them directly through the application through something like push notification. I find push notifications usually have a far higher opt-in rate, much higher. I think people just are really kind of tuning out of email. But yeah, usually, if you select a large enough sample size, you can get a statistically significant response rate for sure.
Cool.
I've got the two thoughts I wanted to add.
Yeah.
One is don't remember one test we've done where we didn't have a hypothesis before we actually set up the test. I'm very wary when some people, that I've worked with, they would be a test, and then afterwards there's a data, and then they try to make sense of it. They try to make a story. I feel like there's a lot of false positives that can come out of that. And the other is I love talking to customers. I think it's such a healthy thing to do. There have been many times where there'll be a new product release or even a new ad that we were thinking of executing and going live with. Starbucks is an amazing place, if you're B2C, to just find people who are smart and have nothing to do while they wait for their coffee. They will always, always watch anything and give you good feedback.
So Alon, rather than reach out to your current users, you try to get kind of a sample of users who aren't currently familiar with your product?
Yeah, yep, I definitely do. At least when it comes to an audio fitness app, it is applicable to almost everybody. So it's not, if it was a more niche product, then it wouldn't work, definitely.
So I'd love for each of you to share the most common A/B testing mistake you've seen colleagues make.
Sure. So, like I said, lots of marketers worldwide, big program, scaling adoption has its challenges. So the biggest mistake I've seen made at IBM is really one-off testing instead of doing like iterative testing. So, given just the amount of tools and the amount of work that marketers already have to deal with in regards to their campaign plans and their page performance, testing is just one more thing to check off the list. And so we deem that as a huge mistake because you can't take the word of one test. Sometimes it's worth running the same test again and again, and then iterating on the test and what other nuances can you find to optimize that user experience further. And so to correct that mistake, we're always enabling our marketers to adopt that mindset of iterative testing, to constantly keep going at it. Don't stop at one and call it a day. You don't reach perfection going to the gym once, right? You need to go again and again to tone the parts of, improve yourself. And same goes for their digital experiences as well. It doesn't stop at one test.
So it sounds like different people are running different tests. How do you manage that? How do you know who's running what tests and make sure that it's all working together? Yeah, so the campaigns are oddly disparate, but at the same time symbiotic, right? Because they're all feeding up to IBM's ROI. But at the same time, each of these business units functions as its own entity because they're each dealing with a different product or offering. And so we have a testing and personalization center of excellence. And so these are around like 9 individuals that are truly ingrained into each of the business units and geographies. So they play a very active role on being on the ground running and helping teams, no matter what their level, whether novice or advanced, to prioritize their tests and start implementing them on the campaigns and pages where it makes sense. And so they provide kind of the feelers or like the extra eyes for our central team to understand where marketing is at a whole, as a group. And then from there, we pivot our program and we adapt it based on our marketers' needs. And there's a slew of enablement for them, newsletters, office hours, like quarterly trainings, everything that, anything we can do to get them kind of all levels set on the same page. But you'll always have kind of, different levels of experience in the program. So it is hard standardizing testing across all of them, but we do that by making sure they're all adopting one platform as a unit, and that they're at least enabled on the very basics of understanding what statistical significance is, what it is to run an AA test versus an AB test, what the implications are of adding more variations, how that impacts your sample size. All the basics, at least we try to get them educated on that level. Cool. Justin, mistakes.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest mistakes, and I've worked in startups for a long time, is marketers who check their A/B testing results too early. That's probably the biggest one, and you sort of infer kind of, okay, this is the clear winner based on maybe my 3-day test. And I think there's 2 really important things to understand about why that happens, outside of the fact that most marketers are a little bit impatient and just like to move fast. So I think the most important thing to understand there is that traffic behaves differently, and there's usually a regression towards the mean within your testing results. So you might see like after day 1, you have like, I don't know, like 300% improvement on variant A or whatever. And that just, if you let the test run properly and you kind of set clear benchmarks for how long you want the test to run, how many conversions you want, how much traffic you want, you'll see that change and kind of balance out. And then the second part to understand there, and you see this more in product testing, is this idea of a novelty factor. So if you really do introduce something dramatically different within your product, it could be applied to a landing page too. You have like a big blue button where there wasn't one before, or some crazy offer. If you have returning users, a lot of times that will perform much better, but not because it's actually a better feature, not because it's a better offer, but because it's new. And so as you kind of let a test run out properly and you're patient, you kind of, again, see that regress towards the mean usually.
So how do you know how long before you look?
Yeah, so again, it depends on how much traffic you have. I usually wouldn't even check results before maybe like a week or two, at least. And even probably a little longer than that. I mean, listen, sometimes, especially if you're in startups, you have a small team, you have to make decisions based on imperfect data. But the problem with checking results early and kind of thinking that you can infer some insight based on that is that the more you do it, the easier it becomes to accept that as kind of a cultural norm within your organization, and you become less cognizant of the fact you're doing it. So you really, if you are going to do it, just like really call out like, this is not correct. We're just doing this, and we know that it's not good data.
Cool.
Justin, you totally stole my answer.
I'm so sorry.
No, it was a really good answer. So I'm actually very guilty of that, to be totally honest. That I've checked the results way too early, and I think the more mistake I've made that I should share is that checking results early, I think a lot of us will be guilty of it, but make sure not to share any preliminary results or any hopes. You may be really excited. Don't tell your manager. Keep it to yourself. Don't let anyone else on the team waste their mental energy on this until it's proven. 2 days will feel like eternity. A week will. And one thing that I mentioned earlier that we do AAB testing. We do have two controls. One way I feel more confident, if it's not statistically significant yet, but if you do have two controls, you'll see when the test begins, their values are going to be very different, and eventually their values are going to get a lot closer. So that's a good indication that, okay, maybe now I can start paying attention to this more seriously.
Okay, I'm going off script a little. Alon shared a personal mistake he made. Justin, Suman, are either of you willing to share something that you personally, learned by making a mistake from?
So we were actually talking about this before, but it's something that I've been guilty of, and like I think especially like younger marketers or more junior marketers make this mistake all the time, is you kind of fixate on, okay, like what does the landing page look like, right? And I've been guilty of this where you invest, I don't know, like a week into like making like lots of variations and hypothesizing and doing user testing, and then you realize that the CTR of your ads is really low and you have no traffic going there. And so you're like, cool, I mean, maybe I should have spent my time, improving my ads first.
Yeah, I would definitely say not being on the same page with other teammates regarding the media planning, what the spend is, when to actually expect traffic to be driven to the page before just jumping right in and thinking about like all the cool nuances and tests we could be running, because that ties up resources, and it also just takes up time, and then in the end that leads to just overall inefficient use of time and an inefficient test then, because if that can't run properly with the right amount of traffic, it becomes a moot point.
So speaking of marketing, when you're running A/B tests, do you run them during a marketing campaign, or do you try to get learnings before the campaign goes live so that the campaign can be as optimal as possible?
Both.
Tell us more.
So when a campaign is being planned, teams, those that have been testing, will take the learnings, in our central repository and try to apply that in their new planning, and then offer up, the content, the assets, all of that per the previous learning. But the testing plan is then, figured out in context of that campaign plan. And so then they're thinking, okay, well, the past is the past. How do we optimize for the present, and then going forward? So it is both. They take from our repository of learnings and then they apply to their current campaigns. Again, each campaign is so nuanced based on product, based on the buyer type. Mainframes have a lot more people involved, a lot more roles and decision makers, whereas SaaS, some kind of like easy download software, is probably just a student downloading SPSS, which is our analytics modeler stream application. So each of those products then also have their dependencies on the audience type as well. So it's learnings from past and the present, so both.
So I would say one thing we run into as a company at A&E is people maybe being a little precious about changing things or trying something big, a big idea. How does that work with your companies, and how do you manage that?
The hippo effect. The highest paid person in the room, its opinion, you know, hippo. Yeah, we deal with that a lot. I mean, our marketers do for sure. And, you know, there will be times where, you know, the highest paid person will be like, I believe this is the direction, we have to do it. And oftentimes our marketers have a really hard time pushing back, because how are you going to say no to your boss's boss? And so testing really does help them, you know, validate you know, both sides, you know, of the argument, you know, whether one side loses or wins, whatever. And so it's a great neutralizer, and it's slowly eliminating that hippo effect, because suddenly now, you know, executives and leadership see the value of really testing and validating their assumptions and testing out the hypotheses. So now they're an active part of the conversation. We're thinking, you know, if we do this because of this rationale, then it will yield this outcome. Let's test it out. So now it's no longer a power play, but rather really trusting, you know, the data that's coming out of tests.
Any thoughts?
I think it's really tough, especially, I mean, like, I think that a lot of organizations, and if there's no transparency, it's naturally going to go towards hippo, so transparency and result sharing will help. I think it's more of a cultural question. We were lucky that we had a really big win at Aaptiv, where it was a test that was contributed by, I'd say, 4 different teams. Everyone had a piecemeal stake in this new, I'll say, global Optima test. And after that test, it was much more inclusive and ideas being shared. But then again, if we don't have wins consistent where everyone is involved, and that's actually one of my fears, that it'll just go towards hippo.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree. I think it's a question of culture. You know, for us, we have an advantage of being a small team. We're a startup, but you know, we really kind of emphasize this idea of you know, the obligation to dissent, and we treat sort of, you know, if you don't have a point of view, you're kind of tacitly agreeing with what the group does, and you know, we really try to almost imbue this idea that you should have a point of view on everything and you should be really vocal about it. And you know, one thing, I agree with you, it's a transparency issue. You know, we do one-on-ones with our staff like twice a month, like with everyone on our staff. And it's not like a monologue. It's not like you know, like a compliment sandwich. It's really like, we want them to tell us, like, what are we not doing that we should be doing? You know, what's the biggest opportunity we're missing right now? So that everyone in the organization really feels like they have ownership over the company. Yeah,
and regarding, you know, feeling precious about any one, you know, given thing, I mean, that's part of where transparency comes into play, where if you have your content lead talking to a digital strategist, talking to, you know, all these different roles, then you're opening up the lines of communication, and hopefully you're alleviating, you know, that feeling of, oh, they're sabotaging my work on purpose, or they hate it, and instead saying, no, you know, we're testing out what the best optimal experience is, and it's nothing personal. And so transparency and that whole cultural shift, like these two guys have said, has played a key role at IBM as well.
Do you have any suggestions for how kind of other people, maybe at bigger or mid-sized companies, can show the value of A/B testing? Is it showing one-off tests? Is it a big presentation on 10 tests?
It's making it a part of, you know, the regular, you know, feature presentations, making it a part of, you know, any kind of sprint planning, you know, if they are working in Agile, and making sure that it's just ingrained in their day-to-day. I think the true value of testing comes when it's just ingrained in your work culture, right? When it's not something that's held on a pedestal, or not something that's made to be this like exclusive little gem, but rather something that is a tool, you know, to optimize the experience. Oftentimes, we have marketers thinking like it's just like this unattainable, like holy grail thing that they'll never be able to do, and it's as easy as just starting an experiment, again, with goals in mind and a hypothesis, you know, not just running it for the heck of running it. But even something as simple as a CTA test, and you know, tweaking the copy to be more specific to a product or, you know, the asset, can yield, you know, 200% improvement, and is showing them those case studies, but also putting in context of, you know, these teams have been running these kind of tests for a while. This is not just a one-off test. And that proves the value of testing to larger orgs, which may be slower to adopt it.
I don't know what the answer would be for different sized companies, but the way of sharing learnings. If we failed, then that's a learning. If we want, it's a learning. And if there's no difference, we learned that this level it doesn't exist.
Embracing failure.
But how should each company share that depending on the size, and what's the way to make it engaging that people will actually learn? Because whatever learning we make on marketing should influence product, should influence customer service. Learning should be everywhere, and that's, I think, the really hard part of how to share it.
We have just a few minutes left. Does anybody in the audience have any questions? Don't be shy. No? Oh, yeah. Oh, 1 second, the mic is coming your way, and I was supposed to tell you to raise your hand and wait for the mic.
Hey, how's it going, guys? Thanks for sharing. So my name is Jang from SeatGeek. So you guys mentioned a pretty interesting point, like you wouldn't look at test results in the first couple of 2 weeks or something like that. So, at the end of the day, with those, first 2 weeks of data, will they be included in the test results or no? Or you just think those 2 weeks will just
I think we meant the first 2 days.
Yeah. It was more like just maybe don't look at your test results after 1 day. That said, yes, I would for sure include that in your test results. But I mean, maybe just earmark that as this was the beginning of the test. We have to kind of treat those as maybe potentially a statistical outlier.
Yeah, and just one more quick caveat. I definitely just check it very quickly just to make sure that nothing is broken and that you're tracking everything.
Yeah,
also that, yes.
Please, always QA your
Yeah, please do QA and testing before. Don't let a test run for a month and then be like, oh, we weren't recording anything.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Up, one in the back. Please wait for the mic. He's coming your way.
One of you mentioned in-app messaging as a way of, I guess, collecting data. Can you expand upon that a little further?
Yeah, sure. So I actually think we do it well, but probably the best implementation I've seen of this is actually the Reddit mobile app. They do this really well, where as you navigate between features, as you navigate between flows, and as I'm sure they're pushing you between different versions of the application, they actually will have a pop-up within the application that just says hey, are you liking the app? You press love it or I don't like it, and then they can follow up with additional questions. Integrating it into the application experience in a more organic way, in my experience, has been the best way to get opt-ins for results.
We have 1 minute left for one final question, if anybody has one. Okay, then let's go through the panel, and if each of you share what you think is the most important thing to think about before running an A/B test.
You first.
Yeah. All right, so what do you want to learn, and go for the jugular? What is the actual level point that's going to make a real impact and get you promoted?
Yeah, I would just say treat A/B tests not as an island, not in isolation, but understand that they're part of a larger customer journey, and whether that's at the top of the funnel, and this is how the customer is discovering your brand, or starting to buy something, or whether they're loyal customers and it's in the product experience. Really kind of try to add as much context as you can into the results.
Yeah, and I'd say the most important thing for an A/B test is just measuring the right things and understanding the drivers to performance, so that when you're hypothesizing, you're putting that in context of a goal. And in the end, an A/B test without a goal is really a waste of time. It's like driving without a destination. And while driving without a destination during the summer may be actually kind of pleasant, it's not so much so for A/B tests, because you're just wasting everyone's time. So really just goal setting and aligning as a team on what that page goal is and what that campaign goal is, and how that ladders up then for the benefit of the company and for your visitors or your users.
Thank you all so much, and thank you all for spending your time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.